previous to 2015, the question of the homeland was somewhat at a stalemate in Indo-European scholarship. On the one hand, there was the Anatolian farmer model, which suggests that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, or PIE more simply, had lived in Anatolia during the late Neolithic era, and from there spread throughout Europe and parts of Asia. Then we have the steppe model, which postulates that these speakers, lived in the steppe just north of the Black Sea, and from there exploded throughout Europe and parts of Asia. And up to this point, the primary means of supporting one of these models was done through matters of linguistics and archaeology, just as it had been for hundreds of years. And all else was seen as quote-unquote highly suspect, according to linguist archaeologist J.P. Mallory. And in his book, he writes, there had been very little to boost the cause of either camp, other than approaches that took one into the more rarefied and somewhat suspect area of lexicostatistics, or reading the tea leaves of modern distributions of DNA. And he's actually kind of alluding to a major point here. So ancient DNA analysis was relatively new during this time, and there hadn't been serious sampling done in regards to the subject. I mean, it's true there had been models tested using modern DNA samples, but ultimately this was limited and could only do so much to advance the homeland debate itself. But this all changed in February of 2015 when a paper titled Massive Migration from the Steppe as a Source for Indo-European Languages in Europe was published by Haak et al. Quick side note, the analysis of the dataset was generated by the David Reich Lab at Harvard and the Max Planck Institute Lab in Jena, and for this reason, I will refer to it as the Harvard-Jena Paper throughout this video. So, what was so important about this particular paper in comparison to previous ones, you might be asking? Well, for starters, it was based on a dataset of ancient DNA samples from 69 Europeans who lived between 8,000 and 3,000 years ago. So inherently, we got to look at a sample of the actual players involved in the debate, and no longer had to rely on modern sampling to look into the past. Okay, so that's the fundamental importance of the paper. Now let's dig into the analysis of the dataset just a little bit. So first and foremost, as the title suggests, the paper confirms that there were in fact two massive migrations in European prehistory. The first took place during the early Neolithic, around roughly 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, with the arrival of the first farmers from the Near East. These guys are known by a few different names in scholarship, such as early European farmers, early Neolithic farmers, or just simply Anatolian farmers. But just know they're all referencing the exact same genetic group. Alright, so this chart on the screen shows the geographic distribution of archaeological cultures, as well as the proposed routes of migration by these early farmers during this period. You'll note that the various groups that we have here, we have the Western hunter-gatherers in the West, typically abbreviated as WHG, the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers in the North, abbreviated as SHG, and the Eastern hunter-gatherers in the East, abbreviated as EHG. And the Anatolian farmers that migrated into Europe during this period interbred with these various groups to varying degrees as well. So this is very important to recognize for later, as it will demonstrate the makeup of some of the groups that spread the Indo-European languages. The second massive migration the paper discussed, also the more relevant one here, involves a group called the Yamnaya. The Yamnaya were a cultural group consisting of pastoral nomads that resided in the steppe. And at the time of this paper's release, their genetic makeup was a little unsettled since more sampling was needed. The authors basically knew that EHG was involved, but they were less sure about the other half of the genetic signature. But we now know that the missing component was in fact from the Caucasus. So in all, the Yamnaya are an admixture of EHG and Caucasus hunter-gatherer, or CHG. Anyways, by using samples from the dataset as well as the archaeological record, the scholars were able to deduce that this group arrived in Europe during the late Neolithic, which was roughly 4,500 years ago, and presumably spread their language to the region as a result. And subsequently, in the north at least, they intermixed with the Anatolian farmers / WHG that were there, and the descendants there became what's known as the corded ware culture. On this chart, we can see that the genetic makeup of the corded ware group was something like 79% Yamnaya, 17% Anatolian farmer, and 4% Western hunter-gatherer. This chart also tells us that most of northern Europe was affected by this initial wave of migration, whereas the southern portions of Europe wasn't exposed to steppe admixture until sometime later. Figure 2a here shows us a different angle of the same phenomenon here. So to the top left, you'll notice that we have Eastern hunter-gatherers, while the bottom left shows Western hunter-gatherers. And you'll notice how the amnia and the quarterware samples in the top middle-ish start to dilute downwards. That's because they mixed with the existing populations in Europe at the time, the early European farmers and WHG, which lie more towards the bottom. So in the final analysis of the paper, the authors make the claim, our results make a compelling case for the steppe as a source of at least some of the Indo-European languages in Europe by documenting a massive migration around 4,500 years ago associated with the amnia and corded-ware cultures, which are identified by proponents of the steppe hypothesis as vectors for the spread of Indo-European languages into Europe. However, just a mere couple of sentences later, they caution that the location of the Proto-Indo-European homeland that also gave rise to the Indo-European languages of Asia, as well as Indo-European languages of Southeastern Europe, cannot be determined from the data reported here. Essentially, the paper argued that this steppe population, presumably bearing Indo-European languages, had spread over Europe's earlier Anatolian-derived farming population in the north and largely replaced the earlier genetic lineages with its own. Genetic evidence had corroborated archaeological evidence in regards to a massive prehistorical question. I mean, as J.P. Mallory aptly put it, it seemed in fact too good to be true. But just a few months later, another paper was released that would either challenge or corroborate the findings of the Harvard-Jena Paper. It was titled Population Genomics of Bronze Age Eurasia and included 101 samples of ancient humans from both Europe and Asia, all of which were sequenced by the lab at the University of Copenhagen, which explains why it's typically called the 2015 Copenhagen Paper. Apparently, according to Mallory at least, there was actually a race between Harvard-Jena and the University of Copenhagen to release their data, which kind of explains why these papers were published so close to each other, because usually you have to wait, years for things like this. Anyways, as I said, this was a perfect way to test whether the conclusions of the Harvard-Jena paper could be replicated, and therefore also prove the validity of this new revolutionary field in Indo-European studies. And the results were better than expected. Not only did the Copenhagen paper support the Harvard-Jena findings, it literally expanded upon it. Quote, populations in northern and central Europe were composed of a mixture of the earlier hunter-gatherer and Neolithic farmer groups, but received Caucasian genetic input at the onset of the Bronze Age. This coincides with the archaeologically well-defined expansion of the Yamnaya culture from the Pontic-Caspian steppe into Europe. This admixture event resulted in the formation of peoples of the corded-ware and related cultures. I mean, this by itself affirms the crux of the Harvard-Jena paper, but as I said, the Copenhagen paper did more than just this. It even found evidence for an eastern expansion by the Yamnaya. Quote, we find that the Bronze Age in Asia is equally dynamic and characterized by large-scale migrations and population replacements. The early Bronze Age Afanasyevo culture in the Altai-Sayan region is genetically indistinguishable from Yamnaya, confirming an eastward expansion across the steppe in addition to the westward expansion into Europe. Thus, the Yamnaya migrations resulted in gene flow across vast distances, essentially connecting Altai and Siberia with Scandinavia in the early Bronze Age. Okay, so some context here. The Afanasyevo culture is strongly suspected by many to be a prehistoric ancestor of the Tocharians, who were an Indo-European people who existed in what is today northwest China during the first millennium, which is absolutely crazy, obviously. So this dataset inherently provides further proof for this ongoing theory. And lastly, the Copenhagen paper showed that the Santashta culture of the southern Urals likely did not genetically evolve directly from the Yamnaya, but instead derived from an eastward migration of the corded-ware peoples. That is quite insane to even think about. Essentially a migration to the west, followed by a migration back east, which is incredible. And the Santashta, for those who don't know, are presumed to be ancestral to the Internovo culture, which the group thought to be responsible for launching the later Indo-Iranian migrations, which, gave us eventually languages like Persian and Hindi. So it seems a lot of pre-existing notions about the spread of the Indo-European languages were supported by these two papers, but in ways we really didn't expect. So, in summary, these two genetics papers made a remarkable impact on the world of homeland hunting. Firstly, they showed that the genetic ancestry of the Amnaya was primarily a combination of eastern hunter-gatherers and a population in the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, CHG. Then, in the west, they provided evidence of late Neolithic, early Bronze Age migrations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which, at least in part, supports the steppe model of Indo-European origins. And in the east, they provided evidence of migration to the Altai Mountains, which had been regarded as a possible route of the Tocharian migrations by scholars. Moreover, they had shown that another migration likely took place from the corded ware region back east to form the Santashta culture, who are implicated in the origins of the Indo-Iranians. All of this in just 2 papers. It's also important to remember that these papers don't inherently discredit the Anatolian hypothesis. It just kind of lends more support towards the steppe hypothesis, at least in the north, of course. But truly, these papers and methods they employed changed the game in academia. They not only attested what both archaeologists and linguistics have been saying for centuries, but they even added more layers to it. And this was only the gateway, to be honest. As Mallory says, quote, "Following this aDNA advent, a series of further studies appeared that seemed to largely support and expand on the initial thrust of the 2 papers," end quote. Well, hopefully you guys now see the importance of these 2 papers and see the impact that they've had on the field at large, all because of the aDNA revolution. That's kind of the heart of the matter here. They kind of represent that at this point anyways. Yeah, so let me know if you guys want me to cover another paper on this topic, as there are plenty of others to cover. Plus, this stuff genuinely interests me, which I would never admit that out loud. But I feel that there aren't many videos discussing the actual literature on YouTube for whatever reason. So yeah, hopefully you learned a thing or two, and thanks for watching as always.